always begin by asking myself, why am I at this meeting? And why am I trying to do what I'm setting out to do? And as far as I'm concerned, when Comrade Bobby opened the gathering at the beginning yesterday, last night, he made it very clear that we are trying to, first of all, celebrate the 90th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. That we do not think that we will come out of this exercise with any hard and fast solutions or, for that matter, resolutions. And I thought about that because it seems to me that the main thing that we really want to do here is to put on the table a number of suggestions and propositions for rethinking our positions. And that's why I say I hope that my presentation will be as clear as Comrade Martin's, because I think he has done exactly that. I'm going to cover three areas with a view to understanding what we mean when we talk about socialism in the 21st century. These issues relate to strategic questions, philosophical issues, and some thoughts on organizational issues. And I also want to say that I base myself to a very large extent on the inspirational work of Ernest Mandel with respect to these questions. So my very first one is to make the statement clearly that I think few of us will deny that there is a crisis of credibility, especially after the collapse of the Soviet system in 1989-1991. And that this was largely the result of the equation of what people understood by socialism with what eventually came to be called real socialism, so-called. In other words, the Soviet model. And in my view, this is perhaps the most devastating legacy of Stalinism, the fact that we've got this roadblock that we have to overcome. However, at this level, at this ideological level, I think thanks to George Bush, as well as Hugo Chavez, we are seeing the beginnings of a turnaround. Once again, people are beginning to visualize and believe in an alternative. We've got away from we are slowly getting away from the idea of Tina, that there is no alternative, to the view, to the Temba view in South African terms, that there must be an alternative, there is an alternative. We are slowly getting into that position. And I'd like to begin by stating with Mandel, a quote from Power and Money on page 240. He says, however many the obstacles in its path, the goal of building a classless socialist society is neither impossible nor located in an ever-receding future. It emerges from tendencies already visible in the world around us, economic, social, cultural, and psychological processes that are pushing in the direction of self-administration. The third technological revolution, with its trends towards the computerization of economic activity and production, distribution, accounting, or transport, contains a powerful dynamic for a reduction in the working week and a major extension of group cooperation as the basic social structure. Society is faced with a critical choice. Either it evolves into a so-called dual society, in which a sector of skilled labor, more or less protected and even scarce in periods of economic expansion, coexists with another sector of degraded, unskilled, and to varying degrees unprotected labor. Or else it imposes a new homogenization of labor with an end to unemployment, a shortening of the working week to 30, 24, and 20 hours, and an enhancement of the role of education, skill formation, and retraining during the producer's lifetime. And so I could go on, but I think we get the basic idea that a socialist society, socialist formation is today absolutely possible. There is nothing to prevent it other than a successful struggle for that. The second point I want to make is that as long as capitalist exploitation and oppression continues, the theoretical and practical critique of its social effects will continue to pose the question implicit in both Vladimir Lenin and John Lennon's versions, another world is possible. We heard that lovely song of John Lennon's yesterday evening. And I'm going to focus then on some of these issues that I think we have to remember and rethink, as I said, in order to move forward. The first point I want to remind ourselves of is that capitalism, and this has been said by others, but I want to repeat it, capitalism will not collapse of its own accord. The so-called resilience of capitalism derives from its so-called creative destructiveness, the fact that wars can be used in order to create conditions for rebuilding, as it were, as they say, as we've just seen now in Iraq. It's not going to collapse of its own accord. Capitalism is quite prepared, the capitalist class is quite prepared to become as brutal as is necessary in order to make sure that the system continues. Hence, and today, more than ever before, this is crystal clear. The choice that faces humanity is, as has often been said, socialism or barbarism. And the barbaric nature of the capitalist system is evident across the world today, whether we're looking at Africa, or Asia, or even at Europe. Because of time, I'm going to have to jump over a few things, but I'm going to try and be as coherent as I can be under the conditions. The question that arises from this proposition that capitalism will not collapse of its own accord is that of the revolutionary subject. In other words, which classes are going to overthrow the capitalist system. Without an organized proletariat, without a class-conscious, revolutionary conscious class, it is impossible that the system will simply not disappear of its own accord. I want to remind us, and I'm doing it a bit tongue-in-cheek and ironically, that Marxists and others have prophesied the death knell of capitalism regularly since 1848. And I want to stress that point because this whole issue of the relevance of the working class today, and I think Comrade Martin and others have made that point also very clear, the continued relevance of the working class as the revolutionary subject ought not to be something that distracts us. You know, people raise this issue from the vantage point of the social movements perspective and so on. But really it's a distraction. As far as I'm concerned, the issue of the centrality of the working class as the revolutionary subject, that class which ultimately can ensure the disruption of the system, is something that in my view is not only decisive, but it should not distract us. There are a lot of other things that go with that, obviously, but I leave that for the moment. Interestingly, Mandel, in a very sympathetic and insightful critique, or assessment rather, of Andre Gortz's critique of economic reason, gets to the heart of the matter. I just want to quote briefly what he says. Yet he says, when Gortz advances his proposals for radical reform, all of which we endorse, and as far as they go rather, he does not touch on the basic power relations within the factory and the firm, or within the economy as a whole, nor does he question the fundamental structures of the bourgeois state. All he wants to do is to democratize them, quote unquote. No wonder that he has ended up as the advisor for the new program of German social democracy. Once you say farewell to the working class, it is not long before you are saying hello to reformed welfare state capitalists, like Diamonds, to welfare state capitalism, If there is no longer a potentially revolutionary subject, then capitalists like diamonds are forever, so long as they don't blow up our little planet. I'll come back to the ecological issue later on. But I think the point is very clear, that if you say farewell to the working class, you're basically saying hello to welfare state as a so-called socialist, so-called radical socialist. The next point I want to make is that capitalism is a world system. The capitalist economy is a world, integrated world system. And what we call globalization today began more than 500 years ago under different and ever-changing technological, political, and social conditions. The present phase of capitalist expansion and penetration, which we call globalization, is no more than the manifestation of the new division, international division of labor, which the United States has hitherto been able to impose, dictate and impose since the end of the Second World War, since the end of the British Empire, basically. So it's not, we mustn't, I think the reason I made that point, I didn't write it down here, but the reason I made that point is simply to say that globalization doesn't mean that we've entered some radically new, qualitatively new phase in the history of capitalism. The capitalist mode of production is exactly the same as it was 500 years ago. The technological, social, and political conditions under which it is being operationalized, as it were, have changed, and the system has changed in many different ways, and therefore our strategies have to change, our approaches, our methods have to change. The nature of the beast hasn't changed at all. From the point of view of revolutionary strategy, the issue we have to ponder much more seriously, in my opinion, is very simple today. Namely, and I stressed this last night in the question I posed, how do we avoid the isolation or encirclement of the incipient socialist revolution in any one country or region of the world? And we can argue, till the cows come home, whether, for example, Venezuela is on a socialist path or not. The important point is that we've got to identify, we've got to identify whether or not the incipient, as I call the incipient socialist revolution, has begun in any particular country, any particular region of the world. Then I also want to say, as a corollary, almost conversely, that delinking some level of autarky is not impossible, but while the extremes of, let's say, Albanianization under most circumstances can be avoided, Cuba, China, etc. have demonstrated that for 2 decades, 2 decades ago already, the social devastation and counter-revolutionary potential of such a strategy are reason enough to reject it. In other words, delinking as a strategy is something that, in my view, for socialists, is extremely problematical, precisely for the reason I say that the counter-revolutionary potential is extremely high. My next point is that socialism really is a process. Now, a few people have said this today already and last night. It really is a process and not an event. The socialist revolution is a process, it's not an event. As a critique of capitalism, socialism is always, and I add necessarily, on the agenda. There can't be, capitalism can't exist without a socialist left critique. It arises from the nature of exploitation and the fact of exploitation, and therefore that critique is necessarily there. Again, we say this because so many people, especially those who have defected to the liberal democratic center or right, maintain that in the present phase of globalization and all the rest of it, socialism is simply not on the agenda. My point is that socialism is always on the agenda as long as there is a capitalist system. This implies that the struggle for reforms that empower the working class and facilitate self-organization and self-emancipation is a necessary part of any socialist strategy, particularly in those times when the socialist revolution is not on the agenda. And I want to stress that we're talking about radical reforms and not about reformist strategy, consensus politics, tripartism, probably what we referred to earlier as co-determination and that sort of strategy. We're not talking about that kind of thing. We're talking about radical reforms that empower the working class, that facilitate self-organization, self-emancipation of the class. Now, these necessarily flow from the understanding that socialism is on the agenda, there's the socialist critique of capitalism is essential, and so on, and that you are always, therefore, involved in the struggle for socialism as a radical socialism. On the other hand, revolutionary situations occur under very specific conditions, and moreover, they are very infrequent occurrences. And by revolutionary situations here, I mean more specifically insurrectionary moments, even though they can last sometimes very long. Insurrectionary moments are very infrequent occurrences. The mark of leadership, as we know very well from the history of the Bolshevik Revolution, the mark of leadership is precisely the ability, among other things, to identify the period or the moment when revolution and ultimately insurrection is on the order of the day. So I distinguish then between socialism on the one hand, the struggle for socialism, and socialist revolution, more specifically the insurrectionary moment in that revolutionary process. In my view, a proper understanding of this distinction would help us to promote the unity of left forces, minimize futile polemics, and focus on the strategic alliances and united front actions that we have to promote as revolutionary socialists, with different views, different approaches, and so on. But the need for strategic alliances and united front actions that we have to promote. I think a proper understanding of this distinction, in other words, that we're not every day living in a situation of socialist insurrection or socialist revolution in that insurrectionary sense of the term. Otherwise, we can all too easily become mere cracked records, caricatures of so-called revolutionaries who discredit the socialist vision whenever they open their mouths. Now that's for the moment all I'm going to say about strategic issues. As I say, there are a lot of other things. I've deliberately, like Pierre did last night, chosen to highlight a few issues that seem to me to be quite significant in the light of this particular gathering, in the light of the discussions that we've had hitherto. I want to focus on a few, in my view, central philosophical issues. In considering the way out of the trough in which the world historical curve of the socialist project seems to be stagnating, the central philosophical issue we have to get clarity on is our understanding of what human beings are, our image or concept of humanity. In other words, what the Germans call the Menschenbild, the image of humanity, the notion of what a human being is in the 21st century, of course. We need to get clarity on this. Revolutionary socialists reject any notion of an unchangeable human nature, conceptualized as a kind of fate or a set of primordial characteristics and dispositions. Again, we have to say this because again, those who have defected maintain that human beings are necessarily egotistic, they are necessarily individualistic, necessarily self-seeking, accumulative, aggressive, competitive, etc., etc. It's not true. As we know from many contrary situations, if soldiers can give up, sacrifice their lives for an idea or defense of protection of a comrade, a fellow combatant, men and women can give up, sacrifice their lives to protect their children and so on, is the very opposite of being individualistic, self-seeking, egotistic, etc., etc., etc. There is no such thing as an unchangeable human nature. Within the limits of our physical beings, within the limits of our natural context, human beings are extremely labile. They can be shaped in many, many different ways, in many different directions. I think it's important for us to say this because the hegemony of capitalist ideology is such, and of course the capitalist-owned media in particular promote this idea that, you know, to have a wonderful motor car, to live in a palace, to have the best, most fashionable clothing, etc., etc., all these things that you know, that these things are natural. That's how human beings are. That's what human beings want to be like. And to get to the youth today, in order to be able to counter that kind of ideology, we have to have a very clear understanding of what the human animal actually is. The second issue we have to get clarity on, in my view, is that of democracy. Now, without going into all the details, some of which have already been touched on here, I want to stress that it is obviously true that specialization or focus makes for profound understanding of any field of knowledge. For example, you get people who specialize on how motor car works. You get other people who specialize on how society works, on how society changes, and so on. These are specialists. These people who are specialized, whether they're sociologists, politicos, historians, whatever. They are people who are specialized. And it makes for a profound understanding if it is done systematically, with discipline and commitment and so on. However, the question is, does that guarantee infallibility? Especially since we are not dealing with inorganic matter under laboratory conditions. Does it guarantee infallibility? And my answer is no. And that's an important answer because it is the basis on which we say today that the socialist movement must accommodate the notion of pluralism. I thought that the discussion that Comrade Pierre suggested, he couldn't go into detail around this issue, is one that we in South Africa in particular need to revisit and need to take very seriously. You know, without trampling on people's toes, I want to say personally that from a discursive point of view, from a point of view of discourse and the way language is used, I do not use the term like band of property. Today, whatever Lenin might have meant, anybody else might have meant, I don't use such a term because it's elitist, it sends the wrong message. It gives the notion of infallibility and so on. And I just feel that we need to rethink those things. As I said, without, you know, I don't want to elicit silly responses to this. I'm putting it quite bluntly that I think those are the kinds of things that we need to think much more deeply about. Perhaps people have, perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps they can tell us, those who use these terms so easily, perhaps they can tell us that it's not elitist, it doesn't imply infallibility and so on, that it doesn't imply a critique of a pluralist, socialist approach. And so, you know, I don't want to go into too much detail, I just want to stress as an example that will become relevant in this particular discussion. I believe that a proper understanding of democracy in a socialist movement context is that we work from principles, not from blueprints. To think that you have a blueprint according to which you check off whether you've done A, B, or C, in my view, is a trap. It's a trap, a political trap, which is going to boomerang at some point or the other. But we work from principles. If you don't have principles, you don't belong in a socialist movement. So, I think it's also important in this particular context, in this discussion about democracy, to be very clear that one of the most important things we have to do, and it's a very responsible thing, is to discern whether or not contradictions amongst socialists are of an antagonistic nature, or whether they tend to become antagonistic. It's an important point, because otherwise we get involved in very futile polemics. We have to study in detail and in context the real power wielded by corporate and state, as well as collectivist bureaucracies, the so-called managerial and intellectual castes. Now, I thought I would have time to go a little bit more into this. I just want to mention that the study of Ernest Mandel's last work, I think, last major work, Power and Money, which is a magisterial synthesis of the theory of bureaucracy, is in my view extremely important. I see in recent developments, particularly in France, and perhaps Comrade Pierre can give us a bit more information about this, that there are tendencies which are taking up this particular analysis and beginning to suggest that in periods of boom, long wave growth and development of capital, that in such periods the managers, the bureaucracies and so on, the bureaucratic caste, if I can use that word for the moment, will tend to be on the side of the workers, will tend to have alliances with workers' organizations, and you tend to move in a social democratic universe. In periods of the long wave, when you're in a trough, you have a sort of financial capital, you have the dominance of finance capital, neoliberal in our modern parlance, and the same bureaucracies will tend to have alliances with capital. Now, it's an interesting consideration, it's an easy point to consider. Two of the authors that I mentioned are Gérard Dumenil and Jacques Bidet, a book that they've just published, apparently one called Another Marxism for Another World. I put it on the table simply because I think it might be useful for us to consider that as one of an innovative, perhaps interesting analysis. I want to make also mention of language, not in the sense which I've already spoken earlier. I just want to mention the fact that we obviously have to guard in our discourse against getting stuck in cliches. We need to work towards imaginative, metaphorically illuminating discourses that light up both the core and the complexity of phenomena. I think it was this morning, or perhaps even last night, I think it was this morning it arose, I just want to mention this. You know, we blindly talk here because we are intellectuals, regardless of whether we spring from the working class or not. We're intellectuals. We blindly talk away in English in a multilingual country where most of the working class don't understand English. It's simply one of those illusions that are spread around that the workers are English speaking. So I think I should mention this, that in order for the working class to be able to appropriate the legacy, not just of the Russian Revolution, but of the Socialist Revolution, we've got to begin to consider using the languages of the workers themselves. And in fact, I think that it's the only way in which the democratization of socialist politics can actually take place. I don't think there's enough of it even in the trade union movement, never mind in the political organizations of the working class. Now, I've been told in no uncertain terms that I must stop. I haven't begun to talk about the organizational issues, but I'm going to conclude. By simply saying very clearly that we have to counter the individualism, antisocial, criminal violence abuse of vulnerable people, whether they are women, children, or old people, aged people. We've got to find ways of countering these and inspiring the youth against individualism and egocentrism, but without erasing the individuality of people, the spontaneity, the inspiration, and so on and so forth. We've got to rebuild neighborhoods. We've got to rebuild both at the point of production, and I think Comrade Martin has done that, has given us some very important ideas in that regard, and at the point of reproduction in the communities, in our neighborhoods, and so on and so forth, in the different organizations in which working class people organize themselves. I was going to say a few words on the significance of the World Social Forum. I'll leave that out now, and also about the transitional program. I'll end off simply by again quoting from Ernest Mandel. On page 243, he makes the point that the key question for human survival is to achieve a qualitative increase in conscious control of the social developments, instead of leaving these to spontaneous, uncontrolled, and ever more destructive processes. The same applies even to human relations with nature. This comes from the fact that ecological disaster is staring us in the face. And finally, from Ellen Maxon's Wood, another very worthwhile socialist theoretician, as capitalism spreads more widely and penetrates more deeply into every aspect of social life and the natural environment, its contradictions are increasingly escaping all efforts to control them. The hope of achieving a humane, truly democratic and ecologically sustainable capitalism is becoming transparently unrealistic. But although that alternative is unavailable, there remains the real alternative of socialism. Thank you.